Okay, thanks everybody. Today is Friday, September 23rd, 2022. And I apologize for the mix-up on Wednesday. I actually did do the whole webinar, but apparently it wasn't being live streamed, nor was it recorded. So I apologize for that, and I will redo the webinar on all about heart attacks next Wednesday. The only other announcement I think is, sorry about that, is we're inviting everybody to the Weston Price Foundation Conference in Knoxville, Tennessee. I believe it's October 21st through the 23rd. Maybe somebody can put in the chat the link to how to sign up for that and how to get involved. I will be there, and Andy Kaufman will be there, and Kelly Brogan and Sally, of course. And it's a great place to meet people and talk with like-minded people and have good food and learn a lot of things. I've learned a lot of things over the 20 plus conferences that I've been at. I see a lot of interesting people, devices, approaches, etc. So please, if you can, come to the Weston Price Conference, Knoxville, Tennessee, October 21st through the 23rd. And about 4 or 5 days ago, I burned my lip. So if I sound like I'm lisping, it's not because I'm drunk. It's because I have a burned lip. So with that, today I was sent an amazing video, really. I mean, it's almost, I could say, one of the final pieces of this puzzle of so-called virology, which is, did we really eradicate polio and smallpox? And what are these diseases in the first place? So I'm going to be showing a fair amount of these clips and then doing some commentary on that. But before I get into that, I had an experience which I thought it was another way, if anybody out there is still on the fence as to whether they believe these viruses exist or not. Take a listen to this. So probably 6 or so weeks ago, I was contacted from somebody, I believe in Australia, who just wanted to connect with me, I guess, and just share some information. His story is fascinating and relevant because he said that he was a retired analytical chemist, spent 50 years doing that. And he became, according to him, I haven't checked him out, and I have no reason to try to check him out, really. He became one of the leading people in the world at finding things that are difficult to find. He described that in his work, he had to find things that were so small and so few in number, 1 or 2 molecules, and so volatile that if he exposed whatever it was to either light or air for like 2 or 3 seconds, he would lose the specimen and he wouldn't be able to find what he was looking for. So he was essentially a world expert at finding difficult things. And he described that when he would find something, he would write up the procedure that he found it, and then sometimes he would submit this to the various journals because these were things that were going to be used in engineering projects or different applications to make real things in the real world. And he said that if he omitted any control step or didn't absolutely prove at every step of the way that what he said he did, he actually did, he would first of all, the journals would reject his article. And as he said, he would be a kind of a laughingstock. If he mixed something with phenol or an antibiotic, which that's not what he did, but anything, he had to prove by doing some kind of control experiment that the antibiotic didn't create the thing that he was allegedly said he found or was looking for. That to not do that essentially automatically disqualified you from the ranks of serious analytical chemists. So somehow, a number of months ago, somebody asked him to look at virology, and I guess he looked at some of my videos, and he started looking into it because he's an expert on finding things. And he read about and found out, how big a virus is, what it allegedly contains, what the proteins and nucleic acids, the size, the morphology, and all that. And he basically said, I could find this in a day or a week. I could find every so-called pathogenic virus that ever was in a week or in a very short amount of time. And then he looked at the procedures that they use to allegedly find these, and he said, this is a joke. They don't do any control. Nobody would accept this kind of work in our analytical chemistry circles. And so at the end of the day, he said, if I had the equipment, I could find every one of these. And the only reason I couldn't find it is because it's not there. And his basic conclusion was none of these are actually there, that the whole thing is basically uncontrolled, make-believe, quote, science, because it wouldn't be hard to find something of that nature based on what he knows. Now, the reason I say this and why I think this is so important is if you think about this even a little bit, like here you are, the head of the NIH, and somebody says, or let me put it another way, if I was the head of the NIH and somebody says, oh, we found this new particle, it's called a virus, or we think we've had other ones, but now we found a new one, and we want to prove that we have a new virus. So here's what I do. I call the 10 leading virology experts in the world and say, okay, how are you going to prove, and I mean absolutely prove, that this is the case, that this thing exists and does what it says you say it does, and is made of what you say it's made of? And so I would get their entire protocols for how you would go about doing this. And then next step I would do is I would find people like this analytical chemist, maybe 50 of them or 20 of them, or I don't know how many of them, enough, and show them the procedures, show chemists and biologists and physicists and plumbers and electricians and everybody I could think of, what do you think about these procedures? Because obviously there's people who are really good at proving and finding that things exist. And I would see if they have any either complaints or suggestions about the procedure that they're going to use. Then I would make a call for anybody who thinks this is not right, philosophically or otherwise, and have an open meeting and find out what they think. Why do you think there aren't these particles? Then I would have the agreed upon procedures done, probably in a similar way to the viral challenge that we laid out, which is a baby step in proving the existence of these viruses. And then when the results came in, I would call the meeting again with everybody from the public and all these chemists and physicists and electricians and plumbers and anybody who thinks they're interested. and go over the data and find out what they think about it. In other words, I would get every opinion I could because my goal would be to prove this wrong. And that should be the goal of every scientist. Is there any possible flaw in this? And what was so gratifying is apparently that's what happens in analytical chemistry. They do everything they can to prove that this particle that you say you found, that nobody else found, you didn't find it because you didn't control for the phenol and you didn't control for the temperature and you didn't do that. And this can't be repeated by 10 different labs. And if you can't satisfy that, fair enough, you didn't find it. And that's how science should be done. Now, the amazing part of this is I don't see how anybody could complain about this. They could say, well, we don't have enough time or we don't have enough money, which is nonsense because we've been doing this for 70 years and we've already spent $100 billion on it. There's no reason not to do this. And that's what's so shocking when I go to all these leaders in the health freedom movement, and none of them essentially want to even say that this baby step viral challenge, that they want to do that, let alone actually do something that would be exciting to find out, is there anything real to this, or can we prove it's not real? We're not even talking about that step. We're talking about a baby step here. This is what they say, so let's try to prove it. And they don't even want to do that. And all I can say is that should tell everybody that there's some other agenda going on here. It is not about proving whether this is true or not, because it doesn't take any genius to say this is how you do it. You find everybody who's interested, anybody who might have input, figure out if they have any issues with the protocol, and you find out what you get. What's the problem? If you can prove that it's not there, it's not there, then you move on. All right, that's enough of that. Hopefully, the more I keep harping on this, I cannot understand why people don't want to put these ridiculous theories to the test. Every single one of them, whether it's the existence of viruses, or I'll talk about next Wednesday. How do you know that blocked arteries cause heart attacks? How do you know that cancer is a genetic disease? Let's find out how we can actually try to disprove that these things are true. Because if you can't, well, then so be it. That's what that's the solution. And if you can disprove it, then let's do it and move on. And again, my point is there's a lot of people out there, they don't happen to be doctors or virologists, but are analytical chemists and maybe plumbers and electricians who can actually look at that and say, that's not the way to do it. Let's do this. All right. With that, let me just say another preface to why I think this video is so important. This is one of those times, and I've said this over and over again, all of us have made a lot of mistakes through our years on living on Earth, me included. There's so many, I hate to even think about it sometimes. But as I've also said, most of them, not all of them, because I've made some sloppy ones, but most of them have been because I believe the dominant narrative too much. And the reason I'm saying this is because having gone through medical school, gone through internship, working in the emergency room, one of the main things that people came in to my practice with, this is now over 40 years, was something to the effect of, I have a rash and maybe I'm sick or my child does, and we want to know what this rash is. And I remember even 35, 40 years ago, having this sort of sense of panic inside. The reason was because I knew, truth be told, that I actually don't know what the rash is. I don't know what the diagnosis is. I don't know whether this was measles or chicken pox or fifth disease or, herpes or something. There obviously were certain characteristics I was told about, but faced with real situations, I had to admit to myself that I just couldn't tell what this was. I didn't know if it was a drug eruption or an allergy or measles or chicken pox or something. And of course, I thought, if I hadn't slept through that dermatology lecture in year 2 of medical school, I bet I would know this because I was so boring and the guy didn't seem to know what he's talking about. So if I only knew more, like these crack dermatologists at UCSF, then I would know exactly that this was this and that was that. But unfortunately, I got my way around that by sort of making up some nonsense and saying, well, all the indications are, it looks like chickenpox. So let's go with that. But I must admit, I didn't know. And the other thing is having been schooled that each one of these skin diseases is a separate viral infection, or at least most of them. Otherwise, it's a separate disease called, dermatitis or allergic eczema or pemphigus or something like that. These are all distinct diseases, and I was meant to learn them and know the individual characteristics. And I had to admit that it was so complicated, and the real world situation was you could hardly tell the difference. But I basically sort of lied to the patients and made up some story about how I know, because they sort of demanded that I must know this because I'm a doctor. But I had this uneasy sense. First, it was that if I only had paid attention, I would know. And then I started wondering what there really is behind this. And I think when you see this video, you will see this puts one of the final pieces in the puzzle, and actually understanding just how these diseases were categorized, or I would say mischaracterized or miscategorized, is one of the keys of understanding the nonsense of virology, the nonsense of so-called epidemics, and the nonsense of supposedly stopping epidemics with so-called vaccines. So let's take a look, and I'll make some comments along the way.
Good news from Geneva. The World Health Organization has made it official. Smallpox throughout the world has been virtually eliminated.
Smallpox is the first and to date the only human disease to be eradicated globally.
The eradication of smallpox is one of the most significant events in the 20th century. For me, it would be up there with the moon landing.
The vaccine. Well, you should know by now that it goes into people. Yes, people in hospitals and clinics and schools, not only in Nyasaland, but as far south as southern Rhodesia, get protection from the vaccine produced at Zomba. And not only people who live in towns, for if they don't go to clinics, the vaccine comes to them. Smallpox could flare up anywhere at any time, leaving death in its wake, were it not for the simple weapon that Edward Jenner placed in the hands of medical science.
Okay, I think I can stop there. So that's the first point, is the alleged eradication of smallpox. And as everybody knows, just about, this is considered one of the, if not the single greatest achievement of modern medical science, certainly of virology, and certainly the crowning achievement of the understanding of the germ theory. First, there was the eradication of smallpox, and then the eradication of polio. And as you can see, this is touted all over the world. Every time you bring this up, people say, yeah, but what about smallpox? What about polio? So let's find out. And by the way, this video was made by our young Russian friend, Kate Sugak, I think is how you say her name. I may have got that wrong. And Kate is amazing. She's done an amazing job with this. It's just an incredible gift to humanity. So let's move on a little bit.
Most people believe that throughout our history, the term smallpox has always meant some specific condition. That is, it can easily be distinguished from any other disease by its unique and specific symptoms. In fact, this is not the case. Throughout history, the term smallpox has been used to refer to a wide variety of conditions. The same is true for such terms as leprosy and plague. In ancient Greece, which is the progenitor of modern Western medicine, any changes in the body or in the human psyche were perceived in a very negative way. Diseases were called defilement, which in Greek means miasma. It was believed that the sick person was unclean, that they had angered the gods, and were possessed by a demon. That person could not have any contact with other people because it was thought that contact with an unclean person could defile healthy people, and the punishment of the gods would extend to them as well. It was this ancient Greek superstition that formed the basis of the modern idea of contagion. It is important to note that in the most ancient forms of medicine, such as traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, there is no concept of disease transmission because they never associated disease with punishment. At the time, it was a Western superstition that, among other things, served as a great way to generate fear, not only for material gain, but also to achieve political ends. In other words, it made it possible to label undesirable individuals as sick, dangerous, incurable, and contagious in order to make them disappear in quarantine, in a plague hut, or in a hospital. Anyone who has had anything to do with the creation and design of prisons knows that most prisons originated on the basis of hospitals. The same thing continued in the Middle Ages. In those days, just as in ancient Greece, in society prevailed the religiously motivated idea that sickness was punishment for sin. The popular term for this at the time was leprosy. The symptoms of what was then called leprosy were constantly changing, to the point where a person without any symptoms could be called a leper. The attitude towards so-called lepers always remained the same. A leper was considered unclean and dangerous and therefore excluded from society. They were tattooed and forced to wear special distinctive clothing and a bell around their neck to make their presence known to everyone. As an outcast, a leper lost all their societal rights as well as the protection of the community. The leper could no longer have any social contact. They had to leave their family. A funeral mass was conducted for the leper because socially they were considered dead, even though they were still alive. This is why the German word for leprosy, Aussatz, translates as exile. How was leprosy diagnosed at that time? For this purpose, they used medical tribunals, which were common throughout Europe. They are described by books containing urban chronicles from the 11th century. It was at these tribunals that priests and city councilors decided whether a person was a leper and whether they should be expelled or placed in a leper colony. Leprosy was not an independent or unique disease. Leprosy, at that time, meant almost any disease, whether respiratory or skin disease. You could be declared a leper for absolutely any reason, even for conditions like hair loss, acne, swelling, or goosebumps in response to a draft. One of the tests for leprosy was whether you got goosebumps on your skin. Because of things like nightmares, if you didn't please someone, that person could denounce you, saying you were screaming in your sleep because a demon called you. You could be convicted if you laughed or sang too much. Another notable test that was done to diagnose leprosy was the singing test. You could also have been accused if you were suspected of witchcraft or if you had had contact with someone who had been declared a leper. If you had any symptoms, you were doomed, but if you didn't have any, you could still have been declared a leper. In the 13th century, the term leprosy was replaced by the term plague, which meant exactly the same thing. Just like leprosy, plague included a variety of conditions. The plague never had a clear symptomatology. It varied from region to region and from year to year, depending on which symptoms were most common. Even now, when you read about plague, you can see so many forms of plague: pneumonic, bubonic, septicemic, and so on. You'll also see that not all epidemics named in historical sources the plague were epidemics of the very disease that today is called the plague. All of this allowed the church, which at that time had all the power in its hands, to use the plague to control the population. For example, they could quell rebellions simply by closing entire neighborhoods and towns to quarantine.
Okay, the point here, as I'm sure everybody understands, is when we read about or hear about, in the Bible or historical accounts or records or novels, oh, this place or these people were hit by leprosy, or they leper colonies, or they had the plague back in 2000 AD or 1500 or whatever it was. We think we're talking about this so-called disease caused allegedly by, like in case of leprosy, a mycobacterium, which has very clear and specific symptoms. And the plague, we have different ones. And so we say those are very unique situations with clear symptoms and clear etiology. And her first point is, by no means is that the case. These were generic terms, meaning you were out of favor politically or economically, or there is something wrong with you. And so they use these to exclude people and to restrict their freedoms and all the usual things just by coalescing them into a certain label which struck fear into people. You can even see the evidence of this. I've talked about there was a leper colony, I think, in New Orleans or so. And in 50 or so years, not one staff person has ever contracted leprosy from pretty much daily contact, sometimes for decades, with lepers. So this never was either a contagious disease or a specific disease at all. So let's go on here and find out more about this.
Especially those whose therapeutic approaches work. Subsequently, the term plague was smoothly transformed into the term smallpox. Significantly, it was called smallpox or petit vérole, lesser evil, as opposed to great pox or gros vérole, greater evil, which meant syphilis. The term syphilis, like leprosy, plague, and smallpox, was a collective term, but applied to people who were committing the greatest sin from the Church's perspective. The Vatican, with its virginity dogma, as well as Roman Catholic theology, which teaches the Immaculate Conception of Mary and thus declares all other people, especially women and sexuality, as such, defiled, have concretized all these ideas in the concept of syphilis. The term syphilis is a collective concept and is a concretization of God's punishment for defiled people. If it became known that a person had an extramarital affair and had any actual or even merely presumed disease, pregnancy outside wedlock being on the list of diseases and considered a sin of the worst kind, they were especially stigmatized, not only by mercury treatments that disfigured and stained their skin, but also by exclusion from society. It was this concept that gave birth to the so-called venereal diseases, the so-called sexually transmitted diseases, which all governments are reverently guarding to this day, all the way up to modern-day AIDS. The term smallpox was used for conditions unrelated.
So here we have a very interesting concept that these sexually transmitted diseases, again, we think when we hear the word syphilis, we think of a very specific disease caused by a very specific spirochete. But it turns out that's not at all what they were referring to. They were referring to some sort of sin in the sort of sexual or feminine realm. And then anytime you were sick or had any kind of skin problem, and you were considered a defiled person or an immoral person or somebody that the church wanted to eliminate for whatever reason, then that's what was called syphilis. And then, of course, they proceeded to poison you with mercury and some other poisons, bleed you and all the rest of it. So if you weren't sick in the beginning, then you became sick. So that's what was meant by syphilis, not the so-called specific spirochete disease that we think of today. So let's go on to smallpox.
Related to sexuality or extramarital relations and applied to any skin symptoms, and in some regions, this term was also used for respiratory conditions and even cancerous tumors. In this connection, it should not surprise us that illustrations from the 13th to the 16th century did not clearly and unambiguously depict the so-called epidemic diseases. Modern medical historians often disagree on whether the artist intended to depict leprosy, smallpox, or plague. And in one of the earliest books on smallpox, dating from the early 16th century, one can see a depiction of the biblical character, Job. In the biblical texts, Job was a righteous man who fell ill with leprosy, so his image was often used in texts about leprosy. Those symptoms with which we associate smallpox today are not observed here. Gradually, as the power of the Vatican waned, after all the abuse and arbitrariness that came from the Church and the Inquisition, people ceased to have any trust for the religiously motivated explanations. Since then, diseases began to be explained by a purely materialistic interaction, and doctors took the same position that priests used to occupy before. As a result, the demon of disease was gradually materialized. The same idea of the demon of disease was transformed into the idea of the toxin of disease. People began to believe that diseases were caused by the so-called toxin of disease, which in Latin means virus, and that a person recovered because their body produced an antidote to the toxin of disease. This idea was supported by the fact that if a person regularly and systematically consumed poisons, such as alcohol, they could not be killed by a bigger quantity of this poison. So people who were afraid that someone might poison them, took poisons as a preventive measure, believing that they were invulnerable because their bodies were now producing an antidote to the poison. But in fact, as it turned out later, the body does not produce an antidote. Our liver produces enzymes to break down and neutralize these toxins. This is why a person who has never had alcohol can die if they drink a large amount of alcoholic beverage. Their liver is not used to producing enzymes to neutralize alcohol. But if a person drinks alcohol systematically little by little and gradually increases the dose, they will not die if they suddenly drink even more alcohol. This is something that people of the past did not understand. They didn't understand that our liver simply produces enzymes to neutralize alcohol and other poisons. They believed in the idea that their body produces an antidote. Because of this, they practiced such things as injecting pus and secretions from sick people through incisions on healthy people to form an antidote to the disease, thus protecting themselves from the disease. It was this misconception that gave rise to the idea of immunity to disease, the modern idea of antibodies and vaccination.
So, as you can see, again, leprosy, which was because you were a sinner against God, became the plague because you were a sinner against the church, became smallpox because, I don't know, you were a sinner against something. And they gradually materialized the cause as people sort of got onto the ruse, and ended up making a material cause, which they, of course, called the toxin of disease, otherwise known as the virus. Never, of course, having seen the virus or found the virus, they just believed because they had always believed. And these illnesses, again, were not specific symptoms, no specific cause. As she goes on in very great detail, even the writings of the physicians at the time pointed out that there was no specific disease that they called smallpox or leprosy or the plague. These were just a group of manifestation of different skin conditions and people getting sick for a variety of reasons. This then, of course, as she points out, became the origin of if you have a poison and the poison doesn't kill you, you must have an antidote, which then became the immune system and antibodies, when actually nothing of the sort existed.
For the same reason, they practiced bloodletting. This was supposed to drain and dilute the toxins of disease in the body. Because of this, however, a lot of people died, like Mozart, and especially hemophiliacs, people whose blood lacks clotting agents for certain reasons. Since it was observed that during famines and wars many people fell ill, before wars and other crises, people were treated with poisons or artificially produced so-called antidotes, such as mercury, which I have already mentioned. This is why mercury is still used in vaccines. The 1.5 liters of salivation per day, caused by treatment with mercury, was considered favorable because it was interpreted that the body was releasing the poison of the disease. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, in his work, Faust, describes precisely and understandably how Faust and his father, as doctors, killed thousands of people with a mercury mixture.
Okay, so again, we have the idea, just like we see, and you get the idea that nothing has changed. So they have a group of symptoms, they collect them into one specific disease, and then they start poisoning people against this so-called specific disease. And that's when people start dying and getting worse. And that's when things start really kind of going to hell. And this was outlined by Goethe back in, I guess, the 1800s. And it's still going on with the so-called injections happening today. And again, I strongly encourage everybody to watch the rest of the evidence demonstrating that there was no specific disease called leprosy or plague or smallpox. These were a collection of different symptoms for a variety of causes that were grouped together. And then when they had so-called therapy for them, they split them apart. And let's move way forward into another clip where you can see exactly how this was done.
It was the same disease until then. regarding lymphadenopathy and chickenpox, a publication entitled The Clinic of Chickenpox in Adults and Children compares the incidence and clinical course of chickenpox in hospitalized patients. 202 children and 55 adults. Quote, lymphadenopathy in children was generalized, but was detected less frequently than in patients older than 18 years. That is, lymphadenopathy is also seen in chickenpox. So we understand that the term smallpox, like leprosy and plague, was used to refer to absolutely all diseases, including respiratory diseases and cancerous tumors. Then, the use of this term was narrowed to refer to all conditions accompanied by rashes. After the introduction of variolation against smallpox in Europe, this term was further fragmented into multiple separate labels. We have discussed some of them, such as measles, chickenpox, and monkeypox, but in reality, there are many more. The first chapter of the 1988 WHO publication, Smallpox and Its Eradication, contains a long list of labels with which smallpox was confused at the time of diagnosis and recognizes that smallpox cannot be diagnosed based on symptoms alone because there are other labels to which these same symptoms can be attributed. After the WHO began mass vaccinating our global population against smallpox in 1958, when vaccinated people subsequently developed symptoms that would previously have been called smallpox, doctors would simply diagnose them differently. That's how smallpox was actually eradicated, just by playing with terminology. The same play with terminology was used to create the illusion that polio vaccines were effective. The symptoms of polio were originally thought to be quite extensive. But on May 12, 1955, in the United States, with the introduction of polio vaccination, these symptoms were grouped under other labels, such as meningitis and encephalitis, and doctors received new guidelines for diagnosing polio, which stated that polio was only paralysis, and only if present for more than 60 days. Thus, polio cases in the U.S. dropped from 50,000 to 60,000 a year to just several hundred cases. So-called epidemics are brought to an end by splitting up one collective term into many different labels. And they are
So I'm going to go on a little bit with this, but this is the most important. And she goes in again. Everybody's got to watch this. She goes into a lot of evidence that this is in fact the case. This is how you end epidemics. You split the same disease into many different components, and then you give each one of them a specific etiology, and you never diagnose smallpox again, even though you already publicized that you can't tell the difference between all chickenpox and smallpox and monkeypox. And she goes into the papers on that. But ever since the smallpox was eradicated, these become other diseases. So voila, you're successful.
Started by the opposite method, that is, by combining these labels into one single collective term. The COVID-19 pandemic was created by reclassifying all the respiratory symptoms that used to be grouped under separate labels under one single collective term, COVID-19. In the case of the current monkeypox story, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control recently stated that the nature of monkeypox rashes in recent cases has
Right. So you can see that the same gambit that was worked ever since hundreds of years ago is still being worked today. You combine a whole lot of different diseases into one diagnosis, and now you have an epidemic. And then when you roll out the supposed cure for the epidemic, you split them into different diseases, and nobody is the wiser until you are all the wiser as of today. Now, the final clip, about 6 minutes, I just want to give a really a clip that describes a really cogent explanation of, so why do people get rashes and sick in the way that we call all these different things, smallpox and chickenpox? And because people, of course, want to know that. So what is happening? And this is one of the best explanations I've ever run across.
skin burn. Today, this condition has nothing to do with so-called viruses and is classified as toxic epidermal necrolysis. It is caused by toxic pharmaceuticals and other toxic substances. Just like smallpox, toxic epidermal necrolysis begins with fever and flu-like symptoms, and the mortality rate is usually as high as 30 to 70%. Thus, if we understand that the smallpox virus does not exist, it becomes obvious that flat-type smallpox is nothing more than a consequence of severe intoxication, that is, poisoning. In this connection, we cease to wonder why in the pictures depicting flat-type smallpox we see such symptoms mainly in people from former colonial countries, such as India, Pakistan, and African countries. Poverty, chronic malnutrition, exhaustion, psychological stress, water and food contamination, toxic drugs, the medical experiments to which they have been subjected, and other toxicological factors which are often present in these countries can lead to such consequences in large groups of people. And the legend of the virus and contagion is used as a cover for all these crimes and negligence. The same applies to the first two types of rashes, now called chickenpox and monkeypox. Chickenpox and monkeypox viruses have never been isolated, neither has the smallpox virus. In fact, they don't exist. This is why you can never eradicate smallpox, but only mask the same symptoms under a new label. Skin rashes are never the result of exposure to a mythical virus. They are the consequence of a detoxification mechanism that involves the skin. What happens is that waste products are thrown into our interstitial fluid, which enter the blood plasma due to hydrostatic pressure. This happens due to the accumulation of nutritional and metabolic acidic wastes, as well as various toxic substances. If these wastes and toxins have not been properly eliminated by our lymphatic system and the four main channels of excretion, urination, defecation, sweating, and breathing, our body removes these wastes through the skin tissue. This begins a process in which the skin fibers become tangled and bulging, creating congestion and swelling in the glands and lymph vessels, and then the waste begins to be expelled through the skin. The nature of the rash depends on what the body is trying to get out. For example, if you open a medical reference book on toxicology and look at the skin symptoms that occur with intoxication caused by various substances, it will become obvious to you how much our skin is involved in the detoxification process of these substances, and you can see the different nature of the rashes when exposed to different toxins. The tendency for children to exhibit skin rashes comes from the fact that the bone growth process is a rather complex mechanism that naturally produces a lot of metabolic waste in children. In addition to this, during bone growth, skin tissue does not keep up with bone tissue, so it is quite typical for children to have low levels of collagen in their skin. Because of this, it is easier and preferable for the body to eliminate these wastes through the skin, and as a consequence, we will see a strong tendency for children to exhibit skin rashes as they grow up. If, in addition to metabolic waste, the child's body has to deal with waste products and toxins from an improper diet, lifestyle, such as not spending enough time in sunlight and producing little vitamin D, a bad ecological environment, or psychological stress, and if the rest of the child's excretory organs are weakened, these symptoms will be more severe. The fact that these symptoms often occur in some children in the same family or group at the same time is because these particular children not only share the same growth process, but also many other physical and psychosomatic factors that give toxic strain to the body, and since humans are social creatures, they tend to go through such processes in sync. But those children who don't have to deal with such a toxic load and emotional stress, who spend a lot of time outdoors, eat differently and so on, will be able to cope with the removal of waste from the body without any noticeable symptoms. So no matter how much contact they have with children with chickenpox, they will not get it. If we look back to the 1700s, when skin rashes were very common in Europe, which motivated Edward Jenner to create a smallpox vaccine, which of course was absolutely useless, we see that people in that time faced not only grueling wars but also natural disasters such as floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions which delayed sunlight for months at a time. All this led to mass starvation and deficiencies of vitamin D, iron, and potassium, which are essential for optimal skin function. Combined with increased intoxication and psychological stress, it is not surprising that, at the time, the manifestation of severe skin symptoms, especially in children, was quite common. The medical establishment sells us the unscientific and never proven idea of the immune system that constantly fights the invisible terrorists that want to attack us in the form of bacteria, fungi, and viruses. We don't have an immune system. We have a cleansing and regenerative system. Our body is in a constant process of cleansing and repairing our tissues. This is one of the main biological programs we have, and bacteria and fungi are directly involved in this process, helping us to cleanse and repair our tissues. Public health will only improve as the quality of life improves. Your health is directly related to your quality of life. The fact that we continue to believe in the existence of viruses and in contagion does not allow us to look at the situation adequately and analyze why we actually exhibit certain symptoms. We don't know how to recognize the factors, both physical and psychological, that affect us negatively, so we can't eliminate them. We spend billions of dollars on mass vaccination programs, only to have those same symptoms then relabeled under a different label because the real cause of those symptoms has never been eliminated. To understand what caused any symptoms, whether it is just one person or a large group of people, we have to analyze what toxicological and psychosomatic factors were affecting people before the symptoms began. The more time you spend in daylight, the cleaner your diet is, the more fruits and vegetables you eat, and the fewer medications you take, the less your excretory organs will be overloaded. If you follow circadian rhythms, eat correctly, and lead as healthy a lifestyle as possible, you will notice that you get sick much less often, and you don't get sick when other people around you get sick. It is important to pay close attention to your emotional state. I highly recommend to have a look to the new German medicine materials if you want to learn to recognize the psychosomatic factors that affect your health. So, let's summarize. We realized that the term smallpox, like leprosy and plague, had been used in the past to refer to absolutely all diseases, including respiratory diseases and cancerous tumors. Then, the use of the term was narrowed and it was used to refer to all conditions accompanied by rashes. The introduction of the variolation procedure against smallpox in Europe caused an even greater fragmentation of this term into multiple separate labels. We have discussed a few of them such as measles, chickenpox, and monkeypox, but in fact there are many more. We discussed exactly how the so-called epidemics are created by introducing one big collective term and how they are brought to an end not through vaccination, but by splitting up this collective term into many different labels and changing diagnostic criteria. We also talked about the lack of evidence of the existence of the smallpox virus. Due to the absence of the virus, any claim that smallpox is transmitted from person to person has no basis in fact. The same goes for smallpox virus tests and claims about the benefits of vaccination. Finally, we talked about the pictures that are used today to promote smallpox vaccination and what really causes these skin lesions. Any additional material that might be helpful to you can be found in the description to this video. Thanks for watching and see you soon.
Okay, I think that about says it all. So it's a brilliant work. I hope everybody watches the entire video. You can see all the evidence that this is the gambit that has been used for thousands of years, and it's about time for it to end. So thanks everybody for listening, and I will see you next Wednesday where we will talk about the heart. Thank you.